Hello! In this video I'm going to be looking at The Great Gatsby and giving a brief introduction. This is the 6th lesson of our literature course, and again I'm going to be looking at this text within the context of AQA's A-level literature spec. That being said though, although I will give some sort of a focus on tragedy, this video will probably work for most other specs because The Great Gatsby is kind of a text which you can focus on in a range of contexts and you kind of get to the same place, so I hope it'll be useful. A good place to start off is the novel's author. F. Scott Fitzgerald was born in 1896 and he died in 1940. Now already you might be thinking he died quite young. Well, he died at the age of 44-ish, and that's something I'll allude to later. He attended Princeton University, which, as I'm sure you know, is probably it's a really prestigious American college. But he dropped out in 1917, and that was all because he was really keen on writing, and as a result, he didn't do very well in this course because he was trying to write stuff. So he dropped out, and he went to a military station in Alabama. This was during the First World War, but luckily for him, he didn't ever get involved in the fighting, and as a result, he didn't die, obviously. He met Zelda Fitzgerald. Now, this is a name which has been associated with a very different type of character, but Zelda is quite infamous if you Google her name. She was famous for drinking a lot, and based on the opinions of people around F. Scott Fitzgerald, it was his relationship with Zelda which prevented him from writing more great stuff. He was also, F. Scott Fitzgerald that is, he was a member of what we call the lost generation of writers. This comes from Ernest Hemingway's A Movable Feast, where a character, I can't remember her name, she refers to the generation which fought in the First World War as the lost generation. She doesn't say it like that, she says that in French, but I'm not going to speak French. So what we mean by this is this was the generation who saw the horrors of the First World War. In fact, some of them even fought in the First World War. As a result, they had this really awful vision of society because they saw how bad it could be. And in many ways we can see how this would affect The Great Gatsby. He died in 1940 largely because of his alcoholism. He was an alcoholic from a very young age. Not like 8 or anything, but when he was at Princeton he started drinking, and I don't think Zelda stopped him too much because she was quite keen on the drink too. He died very young. His story is kind of tragic too if you think about it. And with F. Scott Fitzgerald you get a writer who was battling with his own troubles but was able to write a really magnificent piece of literature. We also need to look at the idea of The Great Gatsby as a modernist novel. Modernism was a school of thought which came about before the First World War, but in my opinion it really began to flourish after the First World War. Modernism moved away from romanticism and to some extent realism by looking more at the stream of consciousness, and what that means is it's all about how I could be thinking about one thing then another thing, and quite frankly if I were to write all of my thoughts down in a stream it'd be really incomprehensible and hard to understand. Well, that's what modernism's all about. It's about looking at the self and looking at how we think, and it's normally done through first-person narrative. It's also quite a pessimistic way of writing literature. Generally speaking, obviously there are exceptions, but this was a school which came about after the worst conflict in human history. And as a result, it's quite easy to see how people who wrote after that were influenced by it, and as a result wrote really gloomy literature. It's also worth considering, as a result of The Great Gatsby being a modernist text, we can also make arguments for and against Nick as a narrator. We can say that he's either reliable or unreliable. In my opinion, I think he's incredibly unreliable, and I think it's kind of hard to make an argument otherwise, but of course literature is all about differing opinions. And just again, a return to World War I, Gatsby himself fights in World War One. In fact, that's kind of how he gets his come up, I suppose, and that it's a really key thing to look at in terms of context for this novel. In fact, I've just realised I've been calling it a novel, but it's actually a novella because it's incredibly small. It's like this big, and it's, I don't know, 150 pages long. So a novel refers to something more substantial, and it doesn't really matter, but I just thought I'd correct myself. And then we need to look at the context of the Roaring Twenties. The Roaring Twenties were all about excess and supposedly about wealth, but if you ever study the Roaring Twenties, you realise that that is absolutely nonsense, because something like 50%, over 50% of people lived below the poverty line. They were mostly black Americans, African Americans, and poor white people. And as a result, I've been saying that a lot this video, but as a result, to see that period as a period of prosperity is to forget how things really were. Nonetheless, the Great Gatsby is the quintessential Roaring Twenties novel. It sums up all of the issues with the excesses of the time. Another thing to do with the Roaring Twenties is the issue of race. Segregation was still very much in force, largely. Well, you need to think, the work of Martin Luther King came in the 60s. And so this is the 1920s. Black people aren't slaves in America, but they're certainly not equal citizens. In fact, I mean, you can even argue today they're not really seen equally, but there is extreme segregation in the sense of wealth, in the sense of power, and just the way they're seen generally. Then we have the Great Depression. If you know your American history, or indeed the history of Europe in the 20th century, the Great Depression is the slamming of the brakes of the Roaring Twenties. You have this huge economic collapse. If you think a few years back we had the 2008 global financial crisis, that was not as bad as the Great Depression. The Great Depression was awful. Huge unemployment, huge poverty, and it came, interestingly, right after one of the greatest periods of prosperity America could ever seen, has ever seen. And so what we see with the Great Gatsby is what many people think it's alluding to is, well, we've had this period of prosperity, and that F. Scott Fitzgerald, writing in 1926, sees that this party is going to come to a halt very abruptly, and it's going to be very messy. Whether or not you think F. Scott Fitzgerald can predict the future is entirely a matter of your opinion. I think there's stuff in there, but of course you need to read the book and see what you think. A final note to leave on, this has got nothing to do with the Roaring Twenties. In fact, I have no idea why I've put it under this heading. But look at the story of Trimalchio. Trimalchio, or as it's properly referred to, Trimalchio's Feast or something. It's a Roman story. Trimalchio was a former slave who, through very dodgy means, managed to become very rich. And what he did was he held really fancy feasts where he had rich people eating his extravagant foods, and towards the end he makes them reenact his funeral. If you've read The Great Gatsby, sounds quite similar. Just a final note on Trimalchio as well. We're not talking about him for the sake of it. We're given some indication of its relevance by the author F. Scott Fitzgerald. He tells us by one of the considered, a title of the novel. Prior to calling it The Great Gatsby, he was considering calling it Trimalchio of West Egg. Yeah, Trimalchio of West Egg, I think. And by having that potential title, we can see how F. Scott Fitzgerald read Trimalchio. He understood its relevance and thought it was relevant in the context of the Roaring Twenties. Finally, if you're not doing the AQA spec, this part is basically irrelevant, but it's important within this book, and this was something I found studying it last year, to constantly see it in the context of tragedy. it's very easy with this novel in particular to start going off on one about the American dream, because it is a novel about the American dream. But it's also a tragedy. If you're doing a spec which orders you to look at it as a tragedy, you must look at it as a tragedy, otherwise you won't do very well. And in many cases you'll end up not answering questions properly because you're trying to talk about what you think the book is about and not what it's telling you to look at the book through the context of. Don't know if that sentence made sense, but I guess you kind of get what I'm saying. So, Gatsby is a very good candidate for a tragic hero. If you've read the book, you know that he comes up from being basically nothing, and then he rises as a socialite and as a businessman. There's also many villains in this novella. If you speak to many people about this novella, they will say that they hate every single character save for Gatsby. This tells you two things. Number one, Gatsby's hell is put on a pedestal, and number two, this novella is full of despicable characters. Nobody likes them because they lack any moral compass. And also there's something to be said for the way Nick, the narrator, portrays characters other than Gatsby, and to some extent other than himself. The rising up of Gatsby is very interesting. As I've alluded to previously, he starts from nothing but seizes on certain opportunities to become something, to become somebody. But the real question, I think, at the heart of Gatsby's elevation from nothing is, to what extent do we say a criminal can be idolised? Because Gatsby is indisputably, he's definitely a criminal. But we still love him anyway. Why? Well, maybe that says something about our society, that we idolise criminals because they've got really big houses and yellow Rolls Royces. But that's something we can look at in this course. Finally, Gatsby's hubris is hamartia. Going back before, hubris means pride thinking that you're better than the gods, and hamartia means tragic flaw. Is Gatsby overly proud? That's something we're going to explore. And also, what are his tragic flaws? Because he has a downfall. Lots of people think it's his love for Daisy. Lots of people think it's his past. Lots of people think it's his obsession with trying to turn back time. I would probably place myself in the latter category, but of course, I'm sure you'll have different opinions to me. I hope this has been useful, and the next video on The Great Gatsby is going to be all about plot. If you liked the video, like it. If you didn't like it, dislike it. And I hope you subscribe to stick around for more content. I hope to see you again next time.